Hello to everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. I hope you're not too tired.
Not at all.
I'm very happy that this previous presentation kind of announced or opened the question of the usage of the term.
You can switch both from two directions.
Is it too?
Yeah.
Too loud now? No.
Oh, it's good.
Yeah. Because this is something that will be present in my presentation, the use of the very term totalitarian, whereas I will be referring more specifically to the use of that term in the study of heritage. But in order to be more coherent and not to make this presentation too long, I will read at least this first part of the presentation. So yes, I also forgot to thank to the organizers for inviting me. I'm especially glad to be for the first time in Sofia, and I must say I'm a bit ashamed of the fact that I haven't been much to the eastern part of Europe, or more east of the former Yugoslavia. But I also think this is one of the issues that needs to be addressed when we talk about contemporary heritage policies of the EU. So. I strongly believe that this kind of exchange among experts in the field of heritage studies, especially among the scholars from or dealing with the heritage from former socialist countries, is of great value for our mutual recognition and offers valuable comparative insights. Most of us who have gone deeper in the research of the historical, art historical, cultural, or some other aspects of the phenomenon of built heritage of former socialist countries are aware of how fragile this heritage is today, and how often narratives they mediate are being manipulated or rewritten. Finally, we all know how much more research needs to be done, especially archival work, field work, comparative analysis. So while working on typology of monuments and memorials dedicated to Yugoslav people's liberation struggle and socialist revolution in Yugoslavia for my PhD thesis, I wanted to collect as many and as diverse comparative literature and visual material as possible in order to get as complete and as unnuanced view of the post-World War II memorial production in whole of Europe. This turned out to be a rather difficult task. Surely, literature on memorial production in the Western Europe and Northern America was relatively easily accessible. The canon has already been written, as in other forms of art and culture. And this is evident from many chronologies and overviews of memorial sculpture that has recently been written in the most prestigious Western publishers. On the other hand, when it came to countries that once belonged to the Eastern Bloc, I faced many practical problems. Publications from the time of monuments production, as well as contemporary ones, were difficult or even impossible to find in Croatian libraries. Socialist monuments were rarely included in the modernist art canon, and information on the internet and other channels were rather scarce, often incorrect, presented as something of a curiosity rather than serious scientific facts. Contemporary academic writing on monuments, on the other hand, have mostly originated from the fields of sociology, cultural studies, anthropology, political sciences, etc., relying on Western theoretical concepts, tackling phenomena such as collective memory and iconoclasm. Despite their immense contribution to the field, they too often took for granted the presupposed otherness of these monuments' formal and typological features. And I must say that in this regard, the first presentation that you gave was kind of interesting for me, because this is exactly my point, that the examples of architecture that we call totalitarian are actually something that we can also find in the U.S. in that very period, on the formal level. I'm saying. I'm not well informed of the situation in other countries in Eastern Europe, but at least in former Yugoslavia, there has been very little practical fieldwork and archival research in the recent period. A kind of research that could open up new perspectives on the original concepts, their social function, and social impact of these monuments. All of these have led, as in many other aspects, niches of cultural, artistic, and scientific production, to something that late Polish art historian and theoretician Piotr Piotrowski called hierarchically defined art geographies that are based on the opposite of center and periphery, and which by practices of exclusion produced art canons. As a consequence of the ideological polarization, even after the end of the Cold War, cultural practices of the former East, and I shall add here, including that of memorial sculpture and architecture, has been assumed as much more monolith or similar than those in the West, despite their significant cultural and historical differences. For example, we can have a look at the situation in former Eastern Germany and, for example, Yugoslavia, whereas very often in contemporary syntheses of modern architecture and sculpture, you will find both of these packed in one category. As an epistemological and methodological answer to this situation, Piotrowski urged for transnational and comparative studies, a method he called horizontal art history, which is based on synchronic analysis, unbiased by the existing political hierarchy of art, geographies, and chronologies. However, the answer to his paraphrased slogan that goes peripheries of the world unite by no means implies the replacement of one political construct by another. And by this I am referring to the notion of totalitarianism that has entered European official legislative only recently, but soon became very tangibly reflected on the ways in which EU cultural and heritage programs have been framed. Although this is not the occasion to go into more detailed and grounded analysis of the origins and the uses and misuses of the term as such, and we had the chance by the colleague to give us more explanations of that, it must be noted here that its non-scientific foundations and political misuses have been heavily criticized ever since the 60s, and this criticism is still being produced in the academia. Significantly, after the fall of the communist regimes in the late 80s and early 90s, the use of the term totalitarian has been dominantly present in the heritage discourse of post-socialist countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. I would dare to argue that the promotion of the term totalitarian in current EU heritage programs demonstrates not only the existence of its own authorized heritage discourse, but also reveals its own ideological bias. The totalitarian heritage discourse, often presented as a form of shared or transnational cultural heritage concept, thus also perpetuates the legacy of the Cold War cultural dichotomy. Regarding the focus of my presentation on memorial heritage, I would like to depart from an argument by Rodney Harrison, who is one of the representatives of critical heritage studies, that, as I quote, in contemporary society, the power to control heritage is the power to remake the past in a way that facilitates certain actions or viewpoints in the present. So, in other terms, there is no neutral heritage or neutral position from which we can observe such practices. In order to comprehend the current status of modernist heritage in former socialist countries in Europe, it is indeed necessary to start from the basics, to acknowledge the connection between heritage and the politics of the past. It is also instructive to balance the two processes that Harrison considers central to heritage studies. One is the production of heritage industry, which is led by the official authorized heritage discourses and with the aim of controlling the past narratives. And the other is heritage viewed and used as integral part of the production of identities and communities, in which there is a potential to transform society from below. So we have always these two approaches, and I think they can also be very well reflected in in memorial sculpture. I'm sorry I have to criticize this project, but I do. So a telling example of how things can go wrong if we uncritically accept the authorized heritage discourse, defined on political and not on empirical and professional grounds, can be seen in this database. An attempt to analyze heritage of fascist and socialist legacy on formal level, with the presumption of their common totalitarian nature, combined with unclear criteria of selection and classification, can bring to rather uncanny situations. So one of them is classifying monuments to the victims of fascism or monuments dedicated to Holocaust as totalitarian heritage, only because they were built in the East. Interestingly enough, the monument by the same author, so you can see on the webpage there is a monument dedicated to the Battle of Sutjeska, which is located in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and which historically was one of the biggest and one of the most important battles fought along with the Allies on the Balkan Peninsula in order to defeat the Axis powers. On the other hand, we see a list of monuments included in the database, one of which is the monument called the Ballad of the Hanged. This is the illustration on the right. It was done by the same author, Nader Glig, who did also monument in Dachau concentration camp, approximately at the same time. So a very clear problem that appears here is how can we interpret this sculpture dedicated to the hanged Jew communists in Subotica so differently than the situation that we had in Dachau. But with this example, we have entered so we have tangibly entered the territory of former Yugoslavia and the history of monuments dedicated to this historic period. And I will now try to summon up some of the main characteristics, we could say, of monuments built in the period of 45 years. So between 45 and approximately 1990, in the region of former Yugoslavia, as you all know, who fell apart in bloody wars, series of bloody wars in the 90s. So monuments in Yugoslavia, to start with, are mostly dedicated, or the ones that were built in that period, were mostly dedicated to the victims. The victims of it should be said that the Yugoslavia was one of the highest, had one of the highest rates of victims in Europe. So after USSR, Germany, obviously Poland, then Yugoslavia is on the third or fourth on the list. So this explains why so many monuments. And the analysis that I did on the territory of Croatia shows that indeed more than 80 or 90% of monuments are dedicated to the people with their names, victims of fascism or civilian victims, and also military victims. This is one of the things that needs to be emphasized when we approach this heritage. So much less monuments were actually dedicated in celebration. Especially, there were almost no monuments dedicated to the ideological icons, as was the case in the USSR. So after the split with Stalin, Tito, the new Yugoslavia ideology didn't wanted to make a difference, and there was no monument, for example, obviously to Stalin, but neither to Lenin. There were just several small-scale busts, maybe. Tito also didn't really have so many monuments as some would expect. They were mostly built after his death. They were very often small-scale monuments built around factories or their erection was initiated by local communities. On the other hand, it is also important to have in mind that in terms of number of monuments, maybe I can mention the kind of striking number of 30,000 monuments built during the whole period on the whole territory of Yugoslavia. This is some estimation from the 80s. And here we speak of the whole range of different, for some reason, I don't have, something was supposed to be, it's here. So we have a whole range of formal and stylistic features and very innovative typologies of memorial sculpture and architecture. This is an outcome of a process that happened after the aforementioned split, political and also partly ideological split with the Soviet Union in '48. And then with another kind of approach that Tito's non-aligned self-managed socialism introduced in the early 50s, which also part of this model was the autonomy of culture. So at least on the proclamative level. So in the early 50s, intellectuals gathered and there was an open space for a new generation of artists to also participate in the field of memorial sculpture. And memorial sculpture and architecture, as you all know, it tends to be very, very much traditional. And when we look at the situation, for example, in the 50s, in this area of Europe, in former Yugoslavia, or maybe 50s, 60s, and comparison with the American production at the time, you would see tremendous differences in terms of modernism, actually, right? American new monuments, or a new approach to monuments begins in the early 80s with the Vietnam Memorial. So this new approach on the formal level is something that is appearing much, much later. And this is one of the examples where in the introduction where I mentioned the importance of looking things synchronically and disregarding the existing chronological, ideologically biased narratives. I would also like to mention that in the we have to be careful when we talk about different levels of production of monuments. The dynamics of the actors or the agents included in the production, which I divided into commissioner, author, art critic, and the user, are very complex, and they are changing throughout this period. In some instances, we will see that the main saying will have the commissioner on how a monument would have to look like and to what purpose it would have to serve. While on other examples, we can see that the sort of bottom-up initiatives have brought to the fact that monuments were really conceived and financed by local communities without interference of the central power, without interference of the, for example, Communist Party. Of course, partisan veterans were the main agents who had the saying or the financial means to put to monuments, but there were many other possibilities, as was also recently in a recently published book by German historian Heike Kage explained quite in details. So just to have some visuals, because I I was thinking of whether, you know, like show you all those striking images of monuments, or to be more analytical, and I decided you have so many of them online and on the internet that you can you can see them anyway. So this is one of the approaches of the innovative typologies. It is important to have in mind that these innovative typologies of monuments or memorial sites, to be more precise, were indeed quite closely linked to the historical events, or to the configuration of the land on which the authentic historical events happened. So you have practices that are quite close to land art, for example, in the concentration camp of Jasenovac. And you can see here, and then also the collaboration between artists and architects is something that was crucial for the development of new also typologies, but also aesthetics. Whereas some artists, such as Dusan Žamanja, who is a sculptor, through his work, through his collaboration with architects, developed into sort of an architect. So he started thinking in spatial terms rather than in plastic terms. And I'm again going back to what I said in the beginning. We need to make more archival and more empirical research in order to get to these facts. So we need to look at the original materials of the sketches, of the plans, etc., in order to understand what was the intention of such new approaches to monuments. Then again, we have the story about the commissioning and financing. So this is a monument that was mined in 1992 by Croatian army. It was the highest and the biggest abstract sculpture in open space in Europe at the time, maybe even in the world. And it was dedicated to the victory of the revolution of the people of Slavonia. It's a small region in Croatia. Such a huge structure we would expect to be financed from the center of the power, from Tito himself perhaps. But no, it was actually a 10 years long process that started from the local community who wanted to have an original, unique monument, and who got in contact with the Zagreb-based sculptor Vojin Bakic. And there was also a competition, and the collection of money was lasting for a number of years, until it was finally built and unveiled in '68. And Tito was at the opening of the monument. He was, as I read in some of the reports, he was asked whether he likes it, and he said that he doesn't want to comment. We all know that Tito's personal taste did not really comply with abstract sculptures or abstract art. He was quite traditional in that sense, but the production that I previously now explained was not so centralized, and the development was quite autonomous, was happening quite autonomously compared to some maybe other spheres of culture. Another aspect that I think is quite important, and we also heard so far about tourism, development of tourism, and the integration of memorial sculpture and architecture into economic plans and programs. Well, actually we had that already in the 60s and 70s. There were really elaborate studies done by sociologists, urban planners, economists, and they were done specifically for memorial areas. So those were spomen područja. So those were protected areas of both historical and natural qualities, which were supposed to be developed as some kind of economic model for the development of the rural, passive, or underdeveloped regions. One of such cases is Petrova Gora, and maybe if some of you are familiar with the monument itself, this monument was kind of the last stage of the development of this project, there were even questions of whether a monument should be built or not, or whether this protected area is a monument in itself. So in that period, in those discussions, actually, we can sense a kind of very avant-garde idea of actually giving up on building monuments instead of building better communities. So those were ideas that were going through the notes that we can read in the archives of actually projecting better future by building something on memorial areas instead of investing into the material monument. In the end, the other arguments won, and this huge monument was actually built but never finished in the 80s, and I will show you also some images later. And now we come to the moment of the destruction. This is the monument, the abstract big one that I previously showed you. It was this is a photograph from '92 when the Croatian army mined. It took a long time to destroy this monument. It was not an easy task. So a few days they were trying to make it collapse. And in the media reports, this event was explained as monument was destroyed by a strong wind. So this is some
impressive winds you have.
Yes, it sounds funny, but it was not funny at all. It's just also a clear. It gives a picture of how the political situation was actually manifested in the media in the 90s. In the midst of the war, media were quite obviously controlled. There were also some, of course, reports and journalists who reported objectively or tried to report objectively on these events. But it took us quite a long time, maybe even 20 years, to start talking openly about what really happened and who were the agents who were destroying the monuments. Because it was very often presented as if the people wanted them to disappear, wanted them to collapse. But it is quite difficult to believe that in small villages where you have monuments with the names and surnames of the people of the same families, that those people actually wanted to destroy their own family heritage. So there are still discussions and a lot of manipulation with how to interpret the destruction of monuments, not just how to interpret their building and their ideological meaning, perhaps, but also how to interpret the fact that almost half of the monuments that were built in the 45 years were actually destroyed. Here are some examples of the situation now. So I will just go briefly, because I don't think we have much time, but this monument was dedicated to the first armed resistance struggle in Dalmatia against fascist troops. It was mined in '92. This one was also dedicated to the so-called Battle of the Wounded, or the Battle of Neretva. Another of these big battles led by Tito, and maybe some of you have seen the movie. It was mined in 2000. So these things were not happening all at once. There were various, depending on the political situation in each of the former Yugoslav Republic. Then also, if you take example of Kosovo, monuments in Kosovo are also mostly destroyed after the American involvement also in that process with Serbia. And then again we come back to the Petrova Gora monument. Now mostly the focus is on the built monument, not anymore on the whole protected area idea, which I think would be very interesting so not to renovate the monument, but to renovate the idea, the model that was intended in the 70s. And here you can see some, also this is an example of an contemporary art intervention. There are many contemporary artists who tackle this issue of monuments, of modernist heritage. And I believe that their production was quite motivational, or even brought to the fore, brought to the public speech the issues more easily than the academic discourse. This is the inside of the monument. Maybe some of you are reminded of the Guggenheim Gallery in New York. And the situation now, which obviously the expensive material, the inox, the steel, has been taken off and sold. So the monument now has a completely different appearance from the inside. And here is some statistical data. I did my research on Croatia. This map is quite telling of which monuments and where were destroyed. And you can see that the areas where the war was the heaviest, where the mixed population of Serb and Croat population was mostly present, the monuments were also the mostly targeted. This is not also a complete picture, but the data that I could collect. And on the other hand, you can see that in some areas there was no problem. There was obviously no also ideological problem with them. So it is quite indicative of how we should approach also then their renewal. And on the other hand, now I show you this. The facts on the ground, as I want to say, like the state of the art of what is happening in the area. And on the other hand, you have this virtual perception, virtual sphere that is again happening in the West. So the whole thing started in the late 2000s with artistic projects such as this Spomeniks project by Jan Kempner's photographer from Belgium. And his impressive photos of monuments have spread throughout the internet. People got very interested, although they knew very little about what monuments actually stand for. The artists intentionally didn't want to name them in terms of their dedication. He just put some numbers and toponyms. But then, through times, people more and more got interested in what was actually what they were dedicated to, and projects such as Spomenik Database by an American amateur also appeared with thousands of collected information on each of monuments, an interactive map, and things like that. And finally, we also have phenomena such as the upcoming exhibition in MoMA on socialist architecture in Yugoslavia, in which monuments will be also featured. So you have on the one hand you have the complete lack of institutional care of these monuments, especially in Croatia. I'm now mostly speaking from Croatian point of view because this is what I've been in touch with, but things are different in different former Yugoslav republics. It needs to be emphasized. On the one hand, this, and then on the other hand, the strong popularity, this kind of exoticism that is coming from the West. I'll skip this. So just to get closer to the conclusion, I would sum up with the statement that we have different situation in each former Yugoslav republic. For example, situation in Slovenia is completely different than the one, let's say, in Kosovo, due mainly to political reasons. And here I come again to the argument that heritage studies and the treatment of heritage is actually the current politics. So in Slovenia, the people's liberation struggle is perceived as the moment of independence of Slovenia as well. whereas in Kosovo it is perceived as something, a moment in which Serbian and Albanian side work together. So it was the story of brotherhood and unity that is now not at all welcome anymore, more as a political idea. On the institutional level, there is also quite a lot of mess. Previously protected monuments have gone through various and different phases of revision. Many of them are not protected at all, and it is quite unsure of how this situation will evolve in future. And then there is also quite a small investment in renovation itself. We will see if the projects such as this upcoming exhibition in MoMA, or perhaps some other projects, could raise the awareness of the local politicians. On the other hand, we have continuously grassroots and bottom-up initiatives for their renewal. So the thing is not only in the hands of the official political agenda. It is also there is also work on the field with people renovating monuments as they know and as they have the means. And it seems that this trend is kind of growing lately. I personally see this as maybe the best approach. It is the approach in which really local communities are reacting out of their own need to commemorate, or out of their own need not to forget. And as I said, also the perception from the West, which includes, of course, appropriation, then also different kind of revisionism of the events, and so on, commodification. To just finish, I will just emphasize of what I think it needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about the heritage, memorial heritage from this period. It needs to be done on the transnational, international, horizontal comparative studies. I think that much more studies needs to be done before we can actually make up a model on which to protect them. Because many of these monuments have not been researched, and when you want to present them, you don't have the original materials. And then also we have the problem with the aforementioned authorized heritage discourse that is now also not coming only from the national agendas of on the state level of each of the republic, from Yugoslav Republic, but also from the EU legislative. And by this I'm mostly referring to the notion of totalitarian heritage. And then, in the end, I think it is necessary to develop interdisciplinary methodologies that are based on contextual and empirical research.